Welcome back to another episode of the College Prep Podcast. I'm Megan Dorsey here in Sugar Land, Texas, where I'm helping students both here in person but also on Zoom to prepare for the SAT and ACT to improve those scores so they can improve their admissions options. I'm here today with my co-host.
Hey everyone, I'm Edward from Alma Modern, which is a place for educators to learn how to share academic skills for college success with their students in new and exciting ways.
And Edward, I was reading an article earlier today, and so when we met, I said, hey, maybe we've got a good topic here. Let me just share it with everybody else. Today's source of the topic, believe it or not, Teen Vogue. But Teen Vogue has an article entitled "The Movement Against Legacy Admissions is Expanding to More States and Universities." And the idea here is that legacy admission is giving some type of favorable treatment. It could be a significant factor. It could just be part of a holistic evaluation to students whose parents or grandparents, other family members graduated from that particular school. So it could be that if you had an older brother or sister who graduated from the school and now you're applying, you get some legacy preference. I'll just start by sharing that my own daughter was a legacy student. Now, I'm going to tell you, I don't think it helped her get in tremendously, but both of her parents, as well as her uncle, her aunt, and her grandfather, all graduated from the school that she ended up attending. Did it maybe give her a small leg up in a holistic evaluation? Maybe so. But in some places and in some cases, it can make a big difference. And the general argument here is that the entire practice of legacy admission tends to favor white and wealthy students. It favors people who have a legacy of attending schools, higher education institutions, going back multiple generations. Well, for you, that wouldn't have helped you out much. Yeah. You didn't have that benefit of mom or dad graduating from the school you wanted to go to. And because we know that education tends to follow socioeconomic status, then the people who have that legacy heritage tend to be of higher income. So I think it's a really interesting topic and in some ways maybe somewhat controversial.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so layered because legacy admissions is just one of many practices out there designed to give a competitive advantage to a particular group, right? Mm-hmm. And it's perhaps one that's coming under a lot of heat right now because it does things like favor white and wealthy students. Like I see here, it says that these legacy students are likely to come from families in the top 1% income level. And right. Those are the students who benefit the most. And that's quite shocking to think about, that these students would need a competitive advantage at all.
Well, and these are the students who probably, if your parents are in the top 1% of income earners, already attend the best schools. They have access to private tutors or me to help you with your SAT. They already have all of the other advantages. Yeah. Why do they need an extra advantage for legacy admission?
Absolutely. Ooh, this is a hot topic, Megan. Are we sure we want to tackle it?
Here's the funny thing is when I saw this, I thought to myself, how much are we really seeing an advantage from legacy admission across the board? I'm in Texas, and I have so many clients who are interested in our two big universities, the University of Texas at Austin and Texas A&M. And it's become more and more competitive to get into those schools, and parents are always very disappointed. You mean the fact that I graduated from there isn't really going to help Johnny get in? And I just tell them, no, if you look at all of the applicants they have, they don't have room to take every legacy applicant. And I think that's true across the board. I think at the highest level, though, maybe the fact that there's some legacy applicants is giving an unfair advantage. But I think there's so many schools that they may ask about it, but I don't, at least in my practice, I have not seen unqualified legacy applicants get in ahead of qualified non-legacy applicants. I guess that's once we get to the point where everybody's really qualified, are we giving that tip up to the legacy students?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And what makes it even murkier is that so many schools don't publish official admission statistics, especially these more elite schools. And so we don't have a full picture. We may know the number of students who applied, the number of students who were legacy, but we don't often have a clear breakdown of statistics of, all the different metrics we would need to help ascertain that clear exact number, which I think just adds to the complexity here.
And I think we're seeing a number of changes. And I do think that this Teen Vogue article talked about the fact that recently the Supreme Court ended race conscious admissions. So you're no longer seeing on your college applications asking what race you are. Not that there aren't other tricky ways for us to try to determine that. But if we're putting race away and we're not using race, what are some of these other things that maybe are also unfairly skewing decisions either for or against certain populations? Yeah. And I think that the idea that we should be more fair and we really should just evaluate the applicants equally is true, but I know that's hard to do.
It is. It definitely is.
One of the factors that I've always said I think legacy factor helps with is colleges like to protect their yield. If we admit you, are you coming? If you have legacy status, you probably are more likely to come. We as parents were probably more likely to write the giant check to the university that we both had graduated from. So kid is more likely to enroll there than maybe some other places. But are we just, thinking about yield, or are we actually looking at other factors that aren't necessarily fair or ways that other people could compete? We know there are ways that other students could show, hey, yes, I am likely to attend. You could apply early decision. That gives the school a real good idea that if we admit you, you're likely to come. It's a yield issue there. But I think there are a lot of other factors that go into the entire idea of holistic admissions. And it's really hard to say how much a factor legacy plays.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's interesting that the decision to give preferential treatment based on race was done with before these other types of preferential treatment, right?
Right.
Maybe because it had the most attention at the time, and it seems like maybe this one is now next in line,
right.
And based on this article at least. And so the question is like race, okay, if race isn't a factor, then do we now create across the board? There is no preferential treatment because like you mentioned, there are plenty of other pockets, right? There are grants on campuses that are intended only for certain audiences. It's like, where do we draw the line? Is it at the admissions door, or is it all the services and grants and things available to students on campus? I think that starts to get really messy, even thinking about things like cultural centers, which provide additional support for certain populations of students. Is that a competitive advantage that isn't available to students who come from legacy status if there's not a legacy student center, for example? Where exactly do we start drawing the lines? That's also an interesting question.
Something, I'm going to share some statistics, and we'll include a link to this article in our show notes. One of the things it says at Johns Hopkins University, one of those hard to get into places, it said since 2013, the percentage of students from the incoming class who had a family connection decreased from 8.5% to 1.7%. During the same period, their percentage of first generation or limited income students rose from 16% to almost 31%. And I'm wondering if simply Johns Hopkins found that the number of qualified legacy students who were applying and interested to go naturally dropped or if there was something else. And then the other issue is we hear so much talk about we're trying to increase diversity, and diversity doesn't just mean race, but diversity of backgrounds and experiences. Is it okay to ask whether people are first generation, or is that giving them unfavorable advantage? Now, we can argue if you're coming from a low income environment and you're coming first generation in your family to go to college, you are not getting an unfair advantage. The playing field is already skewed against you in many, many ways. But where is it, like you said, that we draw a line about who we're looking at for different reasons and who we aren't?
Yeah, totally. And I think that when it comes to issues like first gen and limited income students, here they said they had to rise up to 31%. And this is something they're obviously proud of, right? Because the university
Mm-hmm.
president made this statement. But then when we compare that to national statistics of how many students are actually first gen and limited income, we still see that this number is drastically lower, right? And I haven't worked much with college admissions, but looking at, as someone who works with college students getting into grad school, the GRE used to be a big factor. Some schools are doing away with the graduate record examinations exams,
Right.
for grad school admissions. However, the schools who still require it, the students would ask me, how do I get a better score so that I'm more competitive? Because there may be some good amount of weight on this test. And I would say, well, the more times you can take it, research shows, the better you tend to do. The GRE is great at assessing how good you are at taking the GRE. And that's really what it does. And so if you have a lot of means, lots of income, you can take the test as many times as you'd like to take it. And the school only has to know about your best score, right? That's just the way it works. And if you
And you
don't
can
have,
hire someone like me, but not
absolutely,
me, but on the
absolutely,
on the graduate side to help you with
right,
that.
absolutely. And for the student who's got one shot to take this exam and cannot afford the right materials, maybe all they have is a free book from 10 years ago available in their library to study for this test, that the outcome of that may be very different. So even with assessing something like exams to get into these schools to begin with, there's already inherently built in a competitive advantage or disadvantage. And so then you have to ask these admissions factors. I think it's great that they get attention, but it's so buried in, like you mentioned, that socioeconomic status so closely ties into education level and status because the students who have more historically have just performed better in school. That's just the way it is. They're getting into better schools. And so I think when we look at it from this perspective, are we focusing on something that is it's such a tiny amount, right? Like you asked, how much really is legacy status giving you in this admissions, competition? But with a factor like test scores, is that a bigger issue that we maybe should be focusing on? Like, are we focusing on the little things here and there? And when do we start diving into just how layered it is into the full holistic picture of each student?
One of the things that I think is fascinating, going back early 2024, I think it's January, the Daily from the New York Times gave a really good explanation of why schools, and I think at the time they were focusing on MIT, were reverting back to requiring the SAT. And one of their reasons was because maybe scores across the board aren't even. Lower income students don't have the advantage of taking multiple times, test prep, et cetera. But when they required scores, they could identify better the kids who outperformed their circumstances than they could if they made the school test optional. They were finding that the kid who had a 1250, although maybe not the MIT typical average for admitted students, but who was so far above what was expected and what was common at that school or in that district, that kid wouldn't have normally submitted a 1250. But when they made it required, now they can spot some of those kids. So I think there are two sides to it. Are we actually doing better by requiring it? Or are we really furthering that gap, which traces so heavily along the lines of your parents' success? So
And who's the
Just so
magic
many
person?
issues.
Right. And who's the magic person who decides what the thresholds are, what's
Yes.
expected of that student, right? Who decides that?
Well, and of course, if all we're doing is admitting by numbers, well, that's one thing. But and I have clients all the time. I live in a community with tons of engineers, and they love looking at things by the numbers. It seems very easy if all I want to do is take my grade point average and my SAT score, and if I'm at the top, I should be getting in everywhere. But if we look at things by the numbers, there are enough valedictorians in the US this year that there won't be room for all of them if we took every open seat in the Ivy League. We can't always do it by the numbers. Plus, my 4.0 GPA might not be as competitive as your 4.0 GPA. How do we compare that? There's so many things that aren't going to be perfectly measurable. And I think that's why so many colleges say we want a holistic method of admitting students so we can make some judgment calls. This person doesn't have the great grades, but man, look at the work they do in jazz. And they're so innovative in that area where they're going to study. We should give them credit for being excellent there. But that's a hard sell for the parent of the perfect score valedictorian who just got denied admission. So maybe this is a nobody's going to be happy discussion.
Right. And I also wonder with things like lowering enrollments at a lot of campuses, like this is becoming a concern too, So I wonder with this drop at Johns Hopkins, is it just that fewer students are applying? Is that what's happening? So I think that as we are seeing students finding alternatives to college, which is a good thing for the right students. I always say college isn't right for every student.
Right.
But as these kinds of things happen and students have new types of choices available to them, how do we adjust these standards, which often were created, this mentioned here, almost 100 years ago, or over 100 years ago, these types of standards? Why have they not been adjusting to keep up with the change in student enrollment patterns and the demographic of the average student today?
And I would argue that they have changed. I think back to talking to my grandfather when my sister and I were right out of college and grad school, and he was horrified to know that we had made it with no Greek and Latin. So definitely things have changed. The SAT actually used to have Latin on it. We have changed, but I think we're seeing that it's still not a perfect system. And part of the discussion that I have with clients, especially their parents, because it's really hard as a parent. We want things to be fair for our kids. We'll take unfairness for us, but we have a real hard time explaining it to our kids, is that we have to explain that college admissions isn't perfect. You do your best job to put everything out there. But I give a couple analogies. It's like casting a play. We can only have so many guys and so many gals spots, and we already have too many in this position, not enough over here. Or maybe I'm drafting my fantasy football or baseball team. I can't have all quarterbacks. I can't have all catchers. And in that way, people start understanding, okay, maybe there's some things that I can't control that mean I won't get it. And it seems unfair. But I think the best thing that people can do is make sure you have plenty of options. It feels really unfair if you don't have another good backup. But if you get a no from a college and you've got 4 other schools who want you that you like, it really takes the sting out of it. And I think helps people move on from this was unfair to, hey, but I've got something else to go to. And I think that's for me, the takeaway that I want my clients to have.
Yeah. And I really do like that optimistic tone. You're helping me see it in a different perspective. Unfortunately, I don't know that that optimism is woven into this article published in Teen Vogue. I also think that's an interesting choice, right? When you said that this article was in Teen Vogue, I was kind of shocked. I didn't expect an article like this there. Maybe it's just because I'm not up to date on Teen Vogue. But then I wonder already with some of the cynicism and negative publicity colleges have been getting recently since the world shut down, these types of articles, what does that do, right? What was the intention of publishing it in something like Teen Vogue? So I like your positive spin to it.
I do think that there are a lot of problems in college admissions. I do think that college admissions still favors people who already have a lot of advantages. I think that colleges themselves wish that they could get more diverse and interesting classes of people from all backgrounds. I think some of those schools are financially pinched because of just what you said, declining enrollment. Sometimes we've got to have the person who's going to show up and write the check. And I think the other problem is, and I could go on and on about this, I think that the college ranking system years and years ago, we're talking now 40 some years ago, put us on a huge downward spiral when it came to higher education serving all people. Because all of a sudden, we now have this list of whatever number you want to put, 20, 50, however many schools that are somehow now seen as the best. Those are the people who have problems with legacy admissions. Not all of them. I know most of them are trying to do a variety of things to improve it. But if we still believe that the Ivy League is the best set of schools, then we are perpetuating that issue. And I think that's part of what they're trying to get to with this article about legacy admission. I don't think people are worried about legacy admission into the University of Texas, although I have a number of people who wish they could get it. I think that we're still focusing on the wrong places. We're not talking about the right school for me. We're not talking about where I can get, personally enriched in my best education. We're still trying to crack into that list of, I want to be on those certain schools.
Right. And that's why it's so good we have this podcast, right? Because we've been talking about stuff like that.
Exactly.
Talking about stuff like fit is so much more important than the name on your sweater. And then when I shared my personal story of when I chose the name on the sweater, it was all wrong. And same for you similarly. You had to transfer and sometimes fit is so much more valuable. And where are those right professors? Where are the right programs? Where are the right strengths of certain departments? Because a department at your local public school may just be the better engineering program than the big name fancy school somewhere else, right? And so it's so important for us to be holistic as well, not just requiring the universities be holistic, but that we do it too.
And I think that's when I say, let's have some good options. I don't want to tell people, hey, you can't apply to those schools. Those might actually be great schools for you, but the idea that those are the only ones or those are the good schools, I just have a really hard time with.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, we've given people lots and lots to think about, and maybe shout at either their YouTube or their podcast as they agree or disagree with us. If you want to give us some feedback, we would love to get your email, collegepreppodcast@gmail.com. If not, make sure you're checking us out on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, and have a great week.
Bye, everyone.